Rain fell in thin silver needles over the shattered village of Corslet. The sky was a bruised grey, and the ruins below seemed to melt into the mud. Among the wreckage walked a man carrying not a rifle, but a camera, its brass lens dulled by grime, its leather case speckled with blood and rain. His name was Thomas Hale, a British field photographer assigned to document the human side of the war. But over the years, that phrase had come to mean something else, something darker. He had photographed men charging over parapets and men dying beneath them. He had framed faces of boys who smiled for the camera one morning and lay still by dusk. He had caught the light in their eyes, the moment before the world swallowed it whole. Now, in late 1917, Thomas had stopped seeing beauty in a light. Only ghosts. He crouched near a crater, his boot sinking into the sucking mud. A tattered French flag flapped weakly from a pole nearby. Around him, the silence was eerie. The kind of silence that comes after too much noise, when the world holds its breath in disbelief. A faint groan broke it. Thomas froze. He turned, camera swinging against his chest, and saw a soldier half buried under broken boards and stones. The man's hand twitched weakly. Thomas rushed over, dropping to his knees. "Easy, lad, hold on." The man's uniform was German. Thomas hesitated, just for a moment, then pushed aside the debris. The soldier's face was pale, his eyes glassy. He whispered something Thomas didn't understand, then coughed blood that mixed with the rain. Thomas pressed his hand to the man's shoulder. "You're all right, mate. You're all right." But he wasn't. When the soldier went still, Thomas found his shaking hands reaching instinctively for his camera. He stopped himself. "No," he whispered, voice trembling. "Not this one." He covered the man's face with a scrap of cloth and sat there for a long time, letting the rain wash away the blood. That night, back at the make shift press hut, Thomas stared at his film plates under the dim red glow of the lantern. Ghostly shapes appeared on the glass, the dead, the dying, the broken. He'd captured hundreds of them. Each face stared back at him like an accusation. His assistant, a young corporal named Finch, leaned against the doorframe. "You all right, sir?" Thomas didn't look up. "Do you ever wonder if we're part of it? Not just witnesses, but accomplices?" Finch frowned. "Accomplices?" "We're only showing the truth." Thomas gave a hollow laugh. "The truth? I used to believe that. But what good is truth when it only feeds the appetite for more?" He lifted one photo, a boy of 19, grinning under a tin helmet. His face was radiant with youth, his eyes bright. He died 10 minutes after that picture was taken. "I caught him between heartbeats," Thomas murmured. "And now that's all that's left." Weeks passed. Shells thundered on the horizon. Villages were erased. And Thomas's orders grew more insistent: capture morale. Capture victory. But morale had become a rumor, and victory a myth whispered between dying men. One morning, the colonel summoned him. "Your photos are too grim, Hale," the officer said, tapping a stack of prints. "These aren't what the public needs to see." Thomas stared at him. "The public should see what's real." "What's real is victory, Hale. And it's your duty to remind them of it." Thomas's hands clenched. "So we lie." The colonel's jaw tightened. "We inspire." That night, Thomas destroyed every undeveloped plate he had. Days later, during a retreat from Passchendaele, Thomas found himself separated from his unit. The ground shook with artillery, and the air burned with gas. He stumbled through the smoke until he reached a barn barely standing, its walls pitted with holes. Inside were 3 wounded soldiers, 1 British, 2 German. They lay silent, watching him. No guns, no words, only eyes that understood the same truth. Thomas dropped his gear and knelt between them. "You're safe," he whispered. "I'll get help." But he knew no help was coming. He reached for his camera. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then he raised it, trembling. The 3 men, enemies and brothers, watched as he pressed the shutter. The flash of light was brief, but in that instant, their faces were calm. Thomas put the camera down, sat beside them, and waited for dawn. When rescuers found the barn 2 days later, all 4 men were dead. The camera, miraculously intact, was recovered and sent back to London. Inside it was the final plate Thomas Hale had ever taken. It showed no blood, no battle, only the quiet dignity of men who had looked death in the eye and found peace. It was titled The Last Light. And though no one ever saw Thomas again, his photo lived on, haunting, beautiful, and unbearably human. Before the war, Thomas Hale was not a soldier, nor a witness to horror. He was a dreamer behind a lens. London, 1912. The world was still wrapped in colour and optimism then. His studio on Fleet Street smelled of glass plates and lavender oil. People came to him for portraits, lovers, families, businessmen, all wanting their moments frozen in silver and light. He loved that. The way light could carve truth out of shadows, the way a single photo could make someone feel remembered. He had once said to his fiancée, Clara, as they walked along the Thames, "The camera doesn't just capture what's there. It captures what's felt." The quiet between heartbeats. Clara had laughed softly, her hand tucked in his arm. "Then promise me, Thomas. Promise that no matter where you go, you'll keep seeing the world that way, through beauty." He'd promised. 2 years later, war broke that promise. When the news came in 1914, the studio emptied. The young men who used to pose for portraits enlisted. Shop windows filled with flags. Even art, once seen as delicate, turned into propaganda. Thomas was torn. His friends marched away with pride, and he stayed behind with his camera, feeling like a coward. Until one day, a government official arrived at his studio. "You're Thomas Hale, the photographer?" the man asked, glancing at the rows of framed portraits. "I am." The man smiled thinly. "Good. The army needs your eyes. Not your hands, your eyes. You'll document the campaign. Show Britain what courage looks like." Thomas hesitated. "And what if courage doesn't look the way they expect?" The official only said, "Then make it look right." And that was how Thomas Hale found himself in France, carrying a camera instead of a rifle, tasked with shaping history through glass. His first week at the front was intoxicating. The soldiers welcomed him like a mascot. They joked, posed, and laughed for the camera. "Make me look handsome for my girl back home," one shouted, holding up a cigarette. Thomas laughed with them, snapping shots of camaraderie, of smiles in the mud. He thought he was doing something noble, preserving their bravery, their friendship. But the illusion didn't last. His first shelling changed everything. It was near Ypres, early morning. He had been adjusting his tripod when the world split apart. The ground erupted. The air turned to smoke and screams. When he opened his eyes, his camera was shattered, and so were the men who had been posing. One of them lay with his face half gone, still smiling faintly. Thomas couldn't breathe. He crawled to the man, reached for the fallen camera, and in a daze, took the picture. He didn't even know why. Maybe because it was real. Maybe because he couldn't bear for the world to forget him. That photograph, the one they later titled Still Smiling, became famous back home. People called it heroic. They said it captured the glory of sacrifice. Thomas wanted to scream. There was no glory. Only mud. Only loss. Months turned to years. He moved from one battlefield to the next, Somme, Arras, Passchendaele. The names bled together. He photographed everything: victories, funerals, medics hauling bodies through mud. But something inside him began to rot. Each click of the shutter felt like betrayal. Each face he captured haunted him. He stopped writing to Clara. Her last letter, never opened, lay folded in his breast pocket. His comrades joked that Hale had gone half deaf from the shells, half blind from the horrors. They didn't know that every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ghosts he'd trapped in his photos. One night, in late 1916, Thomas sat by a field hospital near the Somme. He watched a nurse tending to a dying soldier. The nurse looked exhausted, her hands trembling. The boy clutched her wrist and whispered, "Tell my mother I wasn't afraid." Thomas raised his camera and lowered it again. He couldn't. Instead, he wrote on a scrap of paper, "Not afraid." He tucked it into the boy's hand before he passed. That was the moment Thomas began to change. He stopped photographing death for beauty. He started photographing truth. His new photos were banned by the military censors. Too grim, they said. Too hopeless. But soldiers loved them. They said Hale's lens was the only one that saw them as they really were, human, broken, still standing. And so he kept shooting, even when ordered not to. Even when the light was gone. By 1917, when he took the last light, Thomas had become something else, not a journalist, not a soldier, but a witness burdened by everything he could not forget. His last surviving plate, found in the ruined barn, showed more than war. It showed what war took. Back home, when the photo was published, Clara recognized the signature etched faintly in the corner. Th. She wept for the man who once promised to see beauty, and who finally did, even in the heart of ruin. Winter, 1919. The war had ended. London was dressed in parades, banners, and noise. Men marched with medals pinned to their chests, women waved flags from balconies, and the papers declared victory at last. But Clara Hale stood apart from it all. She was 30 now, too young to feel so old. The bells rang, children laughed, but inside her the silence was deafening. Every morning she went to Thomas's old studio. The glass windows were cracked from neglect, dust floating in the still air. The camera he once used, his pride, his instrument of truth, sat on a wooden table, its lens cracked but intact. She would polish it gently, whispering, "You saw what he saw, didn't you? You saw everything." The government had sent her a box after the armistice, his effects, they called it. Inside were small fragments of a life once full of hope, his notebook, a rusted lighter, the unopened letter she had written him in 1916, and one glass plate wrapped in linen. No explanation. No words. Only the faint marking. Th. Verdun. For weeks, she couldn't bring herself to open it. It sat by her bedside like a ghost, heavy with meaning. Until one night, when the rain beat hard against her window, she finally unwrapped it. She placed the fragile plate on the light box and turned it on. The image flickered into existence, a soldier kneeling in the ruins of a barn, his hand outstretched toward the light seeping through a shattered wall. His face half hidden in shadow, his eyes fixed upward, not in fear, but in quiet surrender. Clara pressed her fingers to her mouth. She knew those eyes. Thomas had photographed himself. It wasn't vanity. It was confession. The next morning, she walked the photograph to a small gallery on Baker Street. The curator, an older man who had once known Thomas, stared at the glass plate in silence for a long time before saying, "It's the most human thing I've ever seen." When the image was displayed publicly months later, people stopped in the streets to look. They didn't see propaganda or victory. They saw fatigue, mercy, humanity. The press called it the last light. Letters poured in from veterans, mothers, widows. They said it reminded them of the quiet moment after the gun stopped, when all that was left was grief and the question, what now? For Clara, that question never left her. One evening, years later, she traveled to France. Verdun was peaceful now, grass reclaiming the scars, poppies blooming where men had fallen. She carried Thomas's ashes in a small tin box. She walked until she found what matched the photograph, the ruins of a barn, the faint outline of the same stones, the same shaft of light cutting through a gap in the wall. She knelt in the dirt and whispered, "You kept your promise, my love. You saw beauty, even in the end." Then she scattered his ashes in the beam of sunlight that fell across the ground. The dust rose, catching the light like tiny stars. In that instant, she could almost see him, not in uniform, not burdened, but smiling, camera slung around his neck, eyes alive again. And then, just like that, he was gone. Years passed. The war receded into history books. New wars would come, new photographers with their own truths to tell. But in a quiet corner of the Imperial War Museum, behind glass and soft light, the last light still hung. Visitors often paused before it, unable to explain why it moved them so deeply. It wasn't heroic or grand. It was simply human. The plaque beneath read, Thomas Hale, war photographer, 1889 to 1917. He sought beauty in a world that had forgotten what beauty was. And if you listened closely, beyond the whispers of footsteps and murmurs of tourists, you could almost hear the faint click of a shutter. The echo of a man who once captured not war, not death, but the fragile heartbeat of hope.